Hello, and welcome to Witch Bitch, where we talk the real tea. And today we have another Ancient Mysteries episode, which I'm super excited about. So today we're talking about the mysteries of Merlin and the origins of the Merlin legend, as well as its connections to, like, Merlin's connections to Freemasonry, because there's connections there that I've read about. So I'm really excited to be sharing this with you. But before we get into it, I thought that it's super important to announce we are on Spotify now. What? That's so crazy. It took a little while to get us up because we had to download and upload all of the episodes, but we did it, and all of our episodes are up to date now. So if you would like to download our episodes on Witch Bitch and listen to them from anywhere, you can do that now. What the hell? So very exciting stuff. I'm just really happy about that. I feel like we're kind of official now. Okay, so let's start with the Merlin stuff. Okay, so we all know about the legend of Merlin, but for me, I kind of got confused because it's such like a story, like bedtime story sort of thing that's, legend. Like, I just thought that it was kind of based off of 100% fiction. But after reading this book, I realized, and actually, do you mind if I quickly go get it, Mum? It's just out of shot. I will get it to show the audience. So, here it is. It is called The Mysteries of Merlin. So, it's actually to do with the title. And it's written by John Michael Greer. And so all the information I am getting out of this book, so if anyone wants to buy it or wants to read it, there you go. So, okay, let's continue on. I thought that Merlin was completely fictional and that there was no factual or historical basis around the character, and that Merlin was just a character and that was it. But after reading this book, I realized, no, that is absolutely not the case. And it's a bit of a mystery and kind of just very confusing. So just don't expect any answers. Like any of our Ancient Mysteries series, like there's never going to be a conclusion to this, I don't think. So it's just the information. It's curious. So yeah. All right. So the three original sources, or like the oldest sources that we have of Merlin, one of them is Welsh documents that date back to the Middle Ages, like actual documentation. And then we have, the second source is a book written by an author called Geoffrey of Monmouth. And then the third oldest source is poems and stories that were basically like written by anyone, of people who like read the book by Geoffrey of Monmouth. So Geoffrey of Monmouth kind of made the story famous, and then from there everyone just kind of added to it and wrote poems and stuff and made it really big and famous. So let's delve into these three sources, because from there we'll see that there's actual evidence that Merlin and King Arthur and all the characters from the story actually existed. So far, do you have any questions, Mum?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, it's good.
So let's go into the first one, which is the Welsh documents. So there's a number of texts related to Merlin, and the thing is that's kind of strange, well, not really, because it's Welsh documents, is that he's never really called Merlin in it. He's called Merlin, like Myrdddin, and it's like the Welsh spelling of Merlin, like the Welsh pronunciation, kind of.
Was Merlin Welsh?
Yes, well, actually, this is one of the things that kind of gets confusing down the road. But for now, let's just say that he's Welsh, and then we'll get into it later. So, yes, Merlin is Welsh at this stage of, of this episode of Ancient Mysteries. Okay, so there's ancient poems in Welsh that include mentions of like a battle and heroes falling in battle, and they are supposed to be written by Merlin himself, like according to the poems. And then there's also these documents called the Welsh Triads, which is a collection of enigmatic texts that summarize old lore, and they mention Merlin 3 times. I put up 2 fingers 3 times. And then a third Welsh document is, okay, now I'm really sorry. If anyone knows Welsh, then you would understand how hard this is to even like read, let alone pronounce. But it's called the White Book of Rhydderch. I'm guessing is how you pronounce it. I'll spell it for anyone who wants to look into it themselves. It's Rhyddderch, Rhydderch. And it's a medieval book of Welsh stories and poems. And the book states that before England was settled by humans, it was called Clas Merlin. So the class and then the Welsh name of Merlin, which actually translates to Merlin's enclosure in modern day English. Or yes, so it goes from Clas Merlin. And that, like, the book says that Clas Merlin was basically England before it was settled by humans. So basically saying that it was Merlin's land before people came and lived there.
Right.
And yeah, so it's a bit interesting.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so there's just random and sporadic mentions of this man named Merlin throughout these old Welsh documents, and it's really strange and odd, and we'll get into why it's so strange later on, but you'll kind of get to know that there's like, it seems like there's different Merlins, like they all come from different times, or you know, like one book just is about a poem that he wrote himself. Like one document is a poem that he wrote, apparently, and then one document is talking about how England was Merlin's enclosure before it was inhabited by humans. Like they're very far apart, and it takes a lot to connect the dots. So then we get into the best-selling book written by Geoffrey of Monmouth, and he lived in the 12th century, and in 1136 he completed his first book that surrounds Merlin and King Arthur. Well, I won't even say it surrounds them, it mentions them, I think. So the book is called The History of the Kings of Britain, and it's basically the reason why we even know about King Arthur, because remember, the Welsh documents from the Middle Ages only mention Merlin, they don't mention King Arthur, but Geoffrey of Monmouth writes this book with King Arthur. And I think it's important to mention here that Geoffrey of Monmouth isn't writing this as a fictional tale. It's called The History of the Kings of Britain, or of Britain, and like he's using it as like he's writing this as a factual historical document. It's not like a fictional tale like all the other stories that stemmed from this. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So he claims that this book is actually a record of the history. Obviously, that's why he's calling it The History of the Kings of Britain. So he claims that it's a historical document, and it starts from the original settlement It starts from the original settlement of refugees, and they came from the Trojan War, like the people that settled there after the Trojan War. And then it goes all the way up to the reign of King Arthur. So it starts from when people first settled all the way up to the reign of King Arthur. Okay. And the book also states that King Arthur established a brief kingdom amid the chaos of the oncoming Dark Ages. So he kind of describes King Arthur's kingdom as it is kind of like a stand against the Saxons. And King Arthur kind of builds this amazing, glorious kingdom, kind of like an oasis in a way. Like he's found a real balance with his people, and he's made a glorious kingdom where everyone feels listened to and like feels safe there, and it's all against the Saxons basically. And in this story, Merlin does come in, and he holds a great role in the story. And then Monmouth also wrote a second book called The Life of Merlin, and this surrounds basically just Merlin. Like there's no like mention other than one mention of King Arthur. Like there's only one mention of King Arthur, and that's it. So in this second book, it's really strange because Merlin is like a completely different person. He came from being Welsh. In the first story, he's a Welsh, Scottish boy. He's not a man yet. He has, he doesn't have an earthly father. Like in the story, the mum claims that that Merlin's father was like a spirit, kind of like Mother Mary, like that she just got pregnant and the father isn't from Earth, and then she gave birth to Merlin, and then Merlin kind of goes on his journey to King Arthur and helps with the kingdom, kind of like the show, if anyone's ever watched the show. So yeah, but in the second book, Merlin is now a king in Scotland, and after this battle, he goes like, after his kingdom goes into battle and he goes into battle, he like goes insane from, I'm guessing, all the bloodshed or something, I don't know, and he flees into the forest, and he creates basically a new life for himself in the forest, and that's in his second book called The Life of Merlin. So it's very juxtaposed, and yeah, we don't really understand what's going on there because Geoffrey of Monmouth claims both stories are true. So obviously the logical explanation is to just be like, dude, you're lying, like to Geoffrey, but there's some reasons that I will get into why it's kind of not fair just to say that straight away, because there's some historical evidence that supports both stories. So from the first book, there's I won't say character, but a person called Vortigern, and he's kind of like the enemy, I believe, of Merlin, and like he's kind of the enemy role. And Vortigern actually appears in historical documents. And there's also mention of Merlin as well, but Merlin is referred to a different name. So in these documents, it's called the Historia Bretonum, and it's written in the 9th century. It's like from the 9th century, and people from like Vortigern is spoken as Vortigern, and then Merlin is named Ambrosius. But there's some weird things there because even though it's a different name, a bunch of sources, including Geoffrey of Monmouth himself, who's the original like writer, I guess, say that Ambrosius is Merlin's like another name for Merlin, like another name that Merlin went by in his time.
Like an alias.
Like an alias. I don't know where that information is from because the book doesn't mention that, but the original author does say that it's like another name for Merlin. So there's actual historical like documentation that documents a man named Vortigern and a man named Ambrosius, and apparently Ambrosius is another name for Merlin. So I feel like that can't be a coincidence, because like to have Vortigern, it would be a coincidence maybe to have Ambrosius, just Ambrosius alone in historical documentation. You can write that off, but with Vortigern in it as well, like, that had to be something, you know. And then also, the second book connects to historical documents now where Merlin is like a Scottish king. So the battle that Merlin goes insane in the story, this battle actually is a real battle. It's called the Battle of Ardernal, and it happened in the year 573. And it's like a documented battle that actually happened in Scotland, and this was the battle that the story mentioned. So it's a bit weird. And then another thing to add on top of that was this battle was actually mentioned in one of the Welsh poems mentioned before that was linked to Merlin. So it's now mentioned in an historical like documentation that's completely away from Merlin, like not even part of Merlin's story, and then it's also linked to a poem, a Welsh poem linked with Merlin. So kind of weird. Some connections are happening. And in both sources, the historical and the poem, the forest where Merlin like flees to after he goes insane, the forest has the same name in both of these sources as well. So the forest is called the Forest of Caledon, which is interesting. And yeah, I wanted to research if it was a real forest, like recognized by us today, and it's not, unfortunately, because I was wanting to go travel there. But if anyone was wondering, it's not a real place. I mean, I think it is, but it's called something else now, and I don't know what it's called. So this is where we discuss if there's two different Merlins, because maybe there's two different guys that like are called the same name and just happen to build a story for themselves and get into these historical documents and have these stories written about them, because it doesn't make any sense for them to be the same person, because as I mentioned before, the battle that took place happened in the year 573, and the timeline doesn't add up, because from the first story, based on historical documents, Merlin would have to have been born around the year 450, so over 100 years before the battle happened. And in the story, I mean, you might be able to push it and be like, yeah, well, Merlin, he could have lived until 120, it's happened before. But the thing is, in the story, he's like not that old, he's running like any 120-year-old that I've ever seen on the internet would not be able to run into a forest. So yeah, he's like, it's obvious that it's doesn't make any sense, like, as far as timelines go, based on historical data, not just like, you know, any, like, we're basing this off of actual historical documentation. So here's another thing to add even more complication to the story. So Joffrey, in his story, Joffrey of Monmouth also like talks about Merlin being the master builder of Stonehenge, and this is like, well, this is thousands and thousands of years before, so it's kind of crazy and very fantastical to, you know, even think that is a possibility. But there is some intriguing connections between Stonehenge and Joffrey of Monmouth. So back, you know, when Joffrey of Monmouth was alive, there wasn't really any information about Stonehenge, and yet Joffrey knew quite a bit about Stonehenge, and we don't really know how. So it's actually quite confusing how he knows any of this stuff about Merlin. Like, I don't know where this man got his information from. I don't think any of us know, but He talked about the source of the actual stones, and he claims that they came, like, the stones came from the sea, which is true. Some of them did, not all of them. Some of them did come from the sea, and he mentions that they came from Iceland, which is wrong because they didn't come from Iceland. I think they came from Wales, like off the coast of Wales. But if you put it on a map, Iceland and Wales are like from Stonehenge, from the site of Stonehenge. Iceland and Wales are on the same like vector, but just obviously Wales is closer. So, I mean, it can be forgiven that he got it wrong. I'm not very much convinced. But it was weird that he knew that they came from the sea, and it was weird that he got them from the same direction as where they are. And it can be forgiven. I mean, it's thousands of years before Geoffrey was even alive, so, you know, it's just a little bit of a weird coincidence that he was, like, making these calls about where the stones came from, and he was kind of right, in a way. I mean, he was partly correct. So, yeah, and he, like, Monmouth claims that Merlin built Stonehenge as well, and we'll get into that. So, now we have 4 different Merlins. We have the first Merlin, which is the Merlin that, like, had England before it was settled. Remember Class Merlin? That, like, the claim from this old documentation that England used to be called Class Merlin before it was settled, which translates to Merlin's enclosure. So we have that Merlin, which obviously goes back to who knows how long. And then we have the Merlin that supposedly built Stonehenge. So that's 2. And then we have the Merlin from Geoffrey's first story, where he's a Welsh boy and he helps King Arthur, and kind of the sole basis of what the legend of Merlin is today. And then we have the 4th Merlin, which is now 120 something years in the future, and he's now like a Scottish king who like goes crazy. So we have 4 different Merlins, and this is where it gets to me, kind of a bit like weird, because I think based off these mentions of Merlin throughout history, some of them are like from actual historical documentation that's scattered all over the place, like coming from Wales, yes, but in terms of the information itself, it doesn't make any sense. And then we have this random author who just writes a story and a history of the kings of England, and claims that all of this is factually true, and yet we have no idea where he gets this information from, because the information we have from before Geoffrey's time is like just a few bits of information here and there. So he's either found like the Library of Alexander, but just in Merlin stuff, and decided, oh, I've got to document this, and then now today it's lost and we don't have access to it. Like, how does this man know all this stuff? I just think it's really weird mixed with the historical documentation, because at some point Merlin was a real person. We don't know anything other than that. Like, these stories did actually happen in some aspect, but we don't have any more information beyond those things. So one thing that was suggested in this book that I mentioned was that Merlin is actually a god, or was a god. Maybe not like... I feel like all gods come from an existing person, you know what I mean? Like, and then story is created around them. That's what the author, John Michael Greer, says, like, that's what he suggests. And I think that is actually a really powerful point, because when you think about it, Celtic and pagan gods, we know literally nothing about them. Like, we know a few here and there, but the only reason why we know the Celtic and pagan gods from today is through Roman gods, because the Romans, when they invaded, the Celtic regions and religion and spirituality, like when they raided all the Celtic people and pagan people, what they would do is they would take their gods, change them, and create their own Roman gods out of the pagan gods. And so that's the only reason why we know about most of Celtic deities and gods and goddesses today, through interpreting back the Roman versions of them. That's like literally it. Like there's hardly any pagan like historical data or documentation, because it was all burnt, it was all pillaged. Like it's a very, throughout history, it's been completely obliterated basically. So that's why we don't know much about Merlin. That's why we don't know much about paganism or druidry, yeah, and a lot of Celtic practices and stuff. Even witchcraft, a lot of it has been passed down through generations orally, and that's like, it's just kind of crazy how...
Or killed.
Yeah, because we were all killed. I mean, think about the witch hunts, like millions upon millions of women, some of them not even pagans, were killed. And same with men. Men were also hung as well. So like, even just thinking about that, like most of us think that witches were burnt at the stake. That's the story that's told, but it's so wrong. I mean, I think there was a handful of witches, and I say that with quotation marks for those listening, just the audio. I say that because they weren't really bad or even witches. Half of them weren't even witches or claimed to be witches, but there was only a handful of them that were burnt at the stake. Most of them were hung. Like, it's kind of a misconception that they were all burnt at the stake, and that's like, as far as we're talking about the history of Merlin, that is modern day times. This is like, not that long ago, and we still got it wrong. And that we have so much easier access to that information. So of course later down the line, like, there's going to be so many more examples of information getting lost. So this author's suggestion is that there was, like, Merlin was a god in Celtic and pagan spirituality or religion, and then it got lost, and there's no real evidence. Like, in this suggestion, there's no evidence to go for or against this. I mean, there is a bit of evidence for his argument, but sort of circumstantial. Like, I mean, he could be right, but also there's nothing to prove against it either. Like, we can't really make a conclusive guess, because, like, when we think about it, we don't know if Merlin was ever called Merlin by the pagans, and a lot of the time when the names of gods were transitioned into the Roman names, like, they would just literally say, like, the title would be something like God of the Sea, or God of, like, it would be an actual describing sentence instead of, an actual pagan name, obviously, because they're changing and interpreting, and Romans don't speak any Celtic languages. So yeah, there's no way to really know if there was a god that was based off of Merlin, and just because, like, we don't know if they had a different name, we don't know what they called this god, we don't know how to link it back to Merlin in that sense. So yeah, but it would make sense because there's all these mentions of this Merlin throughout documentation, throughout history, and it spreads over a very vast period of time, like a very long period of time. It literally dates back to before England was ever settled by people. And to me, as far as the stories of gods and goddesses go, that very much sounds like the story of a god or a goddess. Like, that the land was named after them before it was settled by humans, and then, like, that definitely sounds like something of a deity. at least. So, now we get into connections in Freemasonry. So, there is some definite interesting connections, and before I freak out, I'm getting this information again from this book, and the author, he is actually a Freemason, which I learnt through reading this book, and at first it freaked me out. And I'm like, oh my god, I'm reading a Freemason's book. But I don't believe, just like anything, nothing is black and white, and there's definitely grey areas, and just because Freemasonry has this big reputation around it, and yes, I will never become a Freemason by any means, but it doesn't mean all Freemasons are bad, and the way that he talks about this information, I can tell that he's really interested and he's really devoted to his work. And he personally says that Freemasonry isn't what people think it is. Now, not saying to believe that, but it's just a little seed that planted in me that grew some curiosity. So I'm open to listening what he says about this information. He's a Freemason, so if anyone's going to know the connections between Freemasonry and Merlin, it is him. So let's get into this. So to become a Master Mason, there's like different degrees of Masonry apparently. To become a Master Mason, like it centers around the death of this man called Hiram Abiff. Now I don't know, he doesn't go into much detail because Freemasons can't talk publicly much about Freemasonry, obviously, but this is kind of what he says, is that it's like we all, like the Freemasonry mastery is based around this one man, and there's apparently a lot of connections between Hiram Abiff and the story of Merlin. So he suggests that throughout history it kind of got muddled up and like all warped, and Hiram Abiff actually is Merlin, and so a lot of Freemasonry is based around the wizard of Merlin, the god Merlin. So let's go into the similarities between the two, and I think it's very, very interesting because, well, we'll get into it. So first of all, as I mentioned before, Merlin has no earthly father. Like, the mum claims that she just kind of Virgin Mary styled her pregnancy and Merlin just came out. So Merlin doesn't really have a father, and not a father that he knows anyway. And then I'm going to go through all of Merlin's things, and then I'll go into Hiram Abiff's. So then also legend claims that Merlin is the master builder of Stonehenge, according to Geoffrey of Monmouth. He also advised King Arthur, which we all know. So Merlin actually suffered a threefold death. I didn't know this. Not many people know this, but according to legend and to Geoffrey of Monmouth, Merlin had a threefold death, so he like died 3 times before he really died. And like it was like 3 things on top of each other, you know what I mean? And then he remained alive in his grave, like he died in his grave, I'm pretty sure. He like remained alive there. Weird.
Horrible.
Yeah, that is horrible. And then we go into Hiram Abiff's similarities. So Hiram Abiff had no father and was the son of a widow, so he didn't have a father figure. Very similar connection there. He was the master builder of the Temple of Jerusalem, so he was also a master builder of something. He advised King Solomon, so he also advised a king. He also suffered a threefold death, so he died 3 times before it actually happened. And from his grave, he didn't remain alive, but he did communicate from his grave. So he remained alive in a sense, like he was still conscious. And another huge similarity that I even thought it was mentioning in, this Ancient Mysteries episode was that Freemasonry literally originates from the area where Merlin originated. like some of the oldest lodges, like the oldest lodges from the Middle Ages, like the Freemason lodges, are literally only 50 miles away from some of the actual sites, historical sites that Merlin was supposed to have, like, lived in. Only 50 miles away. So, you know, it comes from the area where Merlin originated. So I think it's kind of weird. Kind of weird. And I can understand where John Michael Greer kind of lays out his connections, because as we know, in things like Freemasonry, things do get warped and spun and things can happen. So, and it would make sense because Merlin is all supposed to be about like magic and like wizardry, and what's the A word that's like not apothecary. I've forgotten the word. Alchemy, yeah, thank you. Alchemy, and same with Tree of Life, like he has connections to the Tree of Life. So there's a lot of deep connections there that in spirituality can be twisted and warped, and it would make sense. So yeah, that's the information from this interesting book that I found.
The overall arching theme that I get from all of this is the secrecy and the lost information, and not like really not having the correct knowledge to connect all the dots together right from the beginning up until you talk about Freemasonry, because even in Freemasonry there's a lot of secrecy and a lot of mystery surrounding that. There's so many stories of nefarious acts to it being you know, something that is necessary for the world, because they created a lot of the buildings and a lot of the architecture, and you know, so there's like there's conflicting information about all of it.
Yeah,
and that makes it very, very difficult to pinpoint the truth in any one story.
yeah, it like fogs up.
Yeah,
It makes it impossible to directly conclude to one thing, which is why I love sharing these ancient mysteries, because I can't give an answer, but I can give the information, and there's other people out there that, including myself, that can come up with their own conclusions from it. And I think it's when you know what to look out for, it is easy to distinguish between the smoke and mirrors and find the answer in some sense. Like, look, I myself will never know, at least, well, I don't never say never, who knows, but I myself can't imagine, with this information that I know now, to ever come to a physical conclusion of if Merlin was real, if he was if he was a god. And when I say that, I don't mean a physical god who, I'm just talking like maybe Merlin was a person and he was he did incredible things, and people said, oh, this man is actually Merlin the god, and then that's the story that got passed down through history. Like, I'm not saying, and also then there was the original stories of Merlin and having the land called Class Merlin, and before England was settled by people. Like, that might be the original story of a god, and then maybe a man just kind of had the legend around him because he resembled Merlin. People were like, oh, that's the human embodiment of Merlin, kind of like a Jesus thing, you know? But there's never going to be one conclusion that I can take from this, but what I can take is the fundamental lessons from it.
Yeah.
That's what they can't hide. That's what they can't hide with smoke and mirrors and deception and distraction and putting all these other bits of information around it or taking bits of information out. You still have the core right there, and that's that. Well, for me, that's that magic existed on this earth at one stage, and it does carry down. I mean, this story is incredibly old. It must be. If it's in old Welsh documentation, who did, like, where did this documentation come from? Where did it get this information from? Older and older sources. And then you go through, you know, throughout history, and then how destructive, like, Romans and Saxons and all the people were on the pagan religion, and how much was stripped away, and yet we still know that Merlin was a person. We still have this documentation. To me, that says that Merlin must have been a huge figure for there to still be multiple, not just one, but multiple sources of this person that had to exist after all the destruction that this religion has faced, and this, race, I guess, what culture has faced. Like, he must have been pretty big for there would have to have been, like, lots of information about him earlier on for it to be pillaged and pillaged over and over and over again, for us now, hundreds of years later, to still know and have shows and movies and, you know, legends about him still. So that's what I take out of it. I take that he must have been pretty magical, and that magic still exists, and that we're still really meant to know who he is, because, I mean, it's faced all odds. The fact that we still know about him now is a complete miracle. Yeah.
Yeah, very true.
Yeah.
And I think it's a testament to how difficult it is to erase certain things out of history.
And they bloody well tried. I want to know why they tried so, like, why they've made it such a mystery. Because even now that we know about it, him still, the legend still remains today. I mean, nobody knows that it was a real person. I know I didn't. Like, no one thinks...
Because my feeling is that because he was so magical, he had such a magical ability about him, and in a way that is a hopeful story. And if he represents the ability to have the power of magic, maybe we all possess that.
Yeah.
And that kind of information would be very destructive to certain
agendas.
Yeah, to certain agendas and to certain people.
I think that's why there's been such, you know, a huge destruction around it, personally. Yeah. What are they trying to hide?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Awesome, Juliet.
Yeah.
I love the questions and the conclusions and the uncoverings and the conversation. It's been really, really good.
Yeah. It's weird getting back into them, actually. I must admit, like, I was starting to get a hang of it before we stopped last time, and getting back into it is really hard because I want to share the information in a way that people can first understand, and that's in order and, like, is in a structured way, but it's so difficult when the information itself is not structured, like, so yeah, thanks for bearing with me.
No, it was great because I've never heard it put in that chronological order.
Yeah.
And even though it is confusing and it raised a lot of questions for you, it still grounded the information a lot more for me than previously. Because you do see lots of Merlin themed stories and shows and movies, but it's always presented in a way that Merlin is just a story.
Yeah.
Couldn't have been real, or, because it's all so fantastical, really.
Yeah.
And even
Mm. Mm. Yeah. I definitely love legends like this, so yes. Yes. And also, if anyone has any recommendations of legends that they know about or they want to hear about one in particular, please let me know. Comment them because I want to do more from that's suggested by you guys instead of just me. So, yeah. Yeah. Thank you for listening. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Bye, everyone.